Good morning, everybody. Hi there. Good to see you. Great. We're going to make a start. So, welcome to our daily devotional. Um, Today, we're going to look in the book of Ephesians. And just to let you know that we're going to get really quite practical towards the end as well. Okay. But before we do that, let me just mention a friend of mine who was telling me only yesterday that their family have just subscribed to the Disney Channel because they've decided it's far more uplifting and fun than watching depressing Netflix all the time. But the really striking thing about this was that the youngest child in their family is 21 years of age. Um, Now, one of the original classic Disneys, of course, is Lion King. And you may remember the scene where Mufasa has died. Rafiki, the monkey, leads Simba, his Mufasa's son, to the water's edge, where he tells him to look into the reflection and he will see his father. He looks down and he says that he can only see himself. And then Rafiki touches the water and it ripples, and Simba's reflection changes to that of his father, Mufasa. And Mufasa speaks to him and says, Simba. And Simba says, Father. Mufasa says, Simba, you have forgotten me. Simba says, no, how could I? Mufasa says, you've forgotten who you are, and so you have forgotten me. Look inside yourself, Simba. You are more than you have become. You must take your place in the circle of life. Simba says, how can I go back? I'm not who I used to be. Mufasa says, remember who you are. You are my son and the one true king. Remember who you are. And that's the method that the New Testament takes with us as well. It reminds us who we are, and then tells us how we're to live up to that calling, how we're to behave because of who we are. As Joshua was reminding us yesterday from 1 John, you might call it the kind of indicative imperative method in the New Testament. First, God indicates who we are. And then he gives us imperatives. He tells us how to behave because of who we are. Now, in the letter to the Ephesians, Paul says in chapter 1 and verse 4, says, God chose us in him before the creation of the world to be holy and blameless in his sight. In love, he predestined us to be adopted as sons through Jesus Christ, in accordance with his pleasure and will. So that's who we are. We have been adopted as sons through Jesus Christ, and that's all just because of God's love and his pure pleasure that he has made us his sons and daughters. And the rest of Ephesians chapters 1, 2, and 3 really kind of spell out how through propitiation we have adoption. Through God dealing with our sin, turning away his wrath from us, we have therefore now been adopted as his sons. And so in chapter 4 and verse 1, Paul turns to the imperatives. He gives us a list in chapters 4 and 5 of how we should behave now that we know who we are. And in chapter 4, verse 1, he says, therefore, live a life worthy of the calling you have received. Be completely humble and gentle. Be patient, and so on. Live a life worthy of the calling you've received. As someone has said, every believer is God's firstborn, and so higher than the kings of the earth. He must therefore carry himself accordingly. And so Paul tells us in chapter 4 that he wants us to live up to our calling, to grow up into our stature as sons of God. In chapter 4, verse 13, he tells us he wants us all to reach unity in the faith and to become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ, so that we will no longer be infants, tossed backwards and forwards, but instead that we will in all things grow up into him who is the head. In chapter 5, verse 1, he says, therefore be imitators of God as dearly loved children. So, as dearly loved children, now imitate your Father. Live up to your calling. For you were once darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Live as children of the light. For the fruit of the light consists in all goodness, righteousness, and truth. And find out what pleases the Lord. Now, I said I was going to be practical this morning, and so I would like to just point out a few practical things to you. The reality is that all of us, whether we're Christians or not Christians, are facing the same sort of pressures right now as everybody else. Someone put it like this. I think Kate quoted to me yesterday from Facebook, uh, rather amusingly: coronavirus has turned us all into dogs. We roam the house looking for food. We're told no if we get too close to strangers. And we get really excited about car rides and walks. You see, we all have the same basic needs as human beings. We all have a need to connect with other people. It's not good for man to be alone. We all have a need also for structure and routine in our lives. It calms us down and it keeps us at peace that we have a structure to our lives. We all have a need for safety as well. We need to feel safe in order to thrive. And when we don't feel safe, we go into a kind of fight or flight mode, a panic mode, where we're living on the edge. And as panic goes up, rashness goes down. We all have a need for control as well, to feel that we can make choices, that we're in control of where we go, who we see, what we do. And when we don't feel in control, we can become angry and frustrated. And finally, we all have a need for purpose. To be emotionally healthy, we need to feel that we are competent, that we are achieving each day. And these are five massive things that we all need. But all five of these things, to some extent, have been taken away from us during this time. We've lost that connectedness that we used to have with everybody. We've lost that structure and that routine that we used to have. We've lost a sense of safety. We are worried about food shortages in the shops, about our finances, about our jobs, and of course, about the virus itself. And so we're on high alert all the time. We're constantly kind of on edge, feeling quite stressed. We've lost control as well. We don't feel like we're in control of what we can do. And we've lost a sense of purpose as well. We don't quite know now what we're here for and what we're supposed to achieve during a typical day. But because of these pressures, it can lead to certain types of behavior. When we're under pressure, when we're under stress, then certain behaviors can become evident. For example, we can lose our temper. Domestic violence is going up right now because people are turning on the people that are closest to them because they're frustrated, they're angry. People are marriages and so on that can be challenged. People are resorting to panic behavior, to cheating, to breaking the rules, to try and regain some control. People are resorting perhaps to eating too much as a comfort, or to drink too much. You know, every night becomes Friday night for us because all the days blur into one, and perhaps we want to self-medicate a bit, and we kind of find ourselves drinking. And in fact, the statistics show that sale of alcohol has gone through the roof. Some of us, I guess, will emerge from this crisis fitter and healthier, but some of us are in danger of emerging less fit, perhaps more overweight, and with alcohol problems. And we can lose self-control, lose control of our tongue, lose control of our language, lose control of our thoughts. So all of these things are there and can be very tempting for us to give into. And the Apostle Paul lists the sort of things that as Christians we should avoid. And he points out that we don't have to give in to these temptations. We can be different because we are now children of the light rather than children of the darkness. And so we can put on the new self created in Christ Jesus rather and put off the old self. We don't have to be like we used to be. We don't have to be like the people around us. And so he says, for example, put off falsehood and speak truthfully to your neighbor. In your anger, he says, do not sin. He says we mustn't steal any longer, but we must work with our hands so that we can share with those in need. He says, do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful to build others up. He says in verse 31, get rid of all bitterness, rage and anger, brawling and slander, along with every form of malice. Instead, be kind and compassionate to one another. Forgive one another, just as in Christ God forgave you. He says in chapter 5, verse 3, among you there mustn't even be a hint of sexual immorality or any kind of impurity or greed, because these are improper for God's people. Nor should there be obscenity, foolish talk, or coarse joking, but rather thanksgiving. And then finally in verse 18, he says, do not get drunk on wine, which leads to debauchery, but instead be filled with the Spirit, always giving thanks to God the Father for everything. Make music in your heart to the Lord. As I said earlier, every believer is God's firstborn. He must therefore carry himself accordingly. And so here's the point, folks. As sons and daughters of God, we can be different. Although we face the same temptations as everybody else, we don't have to have the same reactions. And the key to being different is, firstly, that we remember who we are. We're sons and daughters of the King. And that, secondly, we then choose to live up to that calling. And then thirdly, I would suggest that we need wisdom so that we can take practical steps, adopt strategies to help us to overcome the temptations and to be different, to be truly sons and daughters living up to our high calling. What practical steps could you take today to be different? Let me just ask you that question as we finish. What steps could you take to overcome those temptations, perhaps to find ways of connecting with people, having a structure and a routine to your day, keeping yourself safe, reminding yourself that God is in control, that you can be strong and courageous because God is with you and he will never leave you or forsake you? What can you do to take control? Take control of yourself. You have a spirit of self-control now. So what can you do to make sure you eat well, you exercise, you control your time, you have alcohol-free days, and so on? There is a lot that we can control right now. And finally, we can have that sense of purpose because our highest calling is to be worshippers of God. And so we can worship God. And as we worship God, we will be reminded more and more of who we are and how, therefore, we can live up to our high calling. So have a great day. And I hope that you do have a good time, a productive time, and enjoy God's grace in your life. Thank you very much for listening. And Joshua will be with you tomorrow to round out our series on adoption. Take care.